In the similar way that we created the transitional rollover over here in the last video, we're going to do the same thing, but this time we're going to be using a transform to actually rotate the logo that we have here, and the transition will animate it as well. So let's go back to our CSS file. And as you can see here, if you're following along with the progress file, I've just added the 2D skew transform and the CSS3 transition for the header P. Now at this point, what we're going to be doing is working with the logo. And as you can see here, the logo is positioned absolutely, so much from the top and left. It's using a background image. It's got a width and a height to accommodate the the size of the picture, which is being used as the background element. And the text indent is set to minus 9,999 because there's some text that's acting as a link. Well, we're just hiding. So within this area, what I'm going to do is to also introduce more CSS3 transitions. Now, we can do this in a number of different ways. Right now, I'm just going to sort of paste in this information that we had on the header paragraph. And as you can see here, the WebKit transition is set to all. Now, if I did not want to set this to all, I could specify that specifically want the transform property to be the one that's animating. And in that case, it would look like WebKit transform. But in this case, I think we're going to be good with this. So if we transition all at 5 seconds, okay, we might want it to be 1 second. We'll have to see, and we'll see how that works as well. Along with this, though, I'm going to copy the first little bit of the logo selector, so that ID called logo, and what we're going to introduce inside here is the transform that we want to include. And that transform, if you remember, was to rotate this thing to 360 degrees. So let me close this before I forget. And within here, we're going to add some information. We could just say transform. And what we're going to declare is we want a rotate transform. And we're going to do this at 360 degrees. So DEG 4 degrees. All right. And as you well remember, all of this information needs to also include specific information about which browser this is going to be working in. So in order to do that, we're going to, first and foremost, we have to recognize that it's not going to work in MS. So Microsoft Internet Explorer is not going to support this. Nevertheless, though, if I were to just copy this information, I'll come in here and I'll include -moz -transform. That's really all I've got to do. And of course, we're going to do the same thing with, I'm going to do it twice because the first time we're going to change this for the WebKit browsers. And the second time I'm going to change this for Opera. So we just have to put in our O right here. And that's how we're going to get this to work. But before we test this in our browser, I'm noticing there's a couple of mistakes here. First of all, I want them to rotate 360 degrees instead of 69, as you see here. But also, I forgot to make mention that the selector with the ID logo, when we copied that information, we have to remember to also indicate that this second declaration here is for the logo's hover state. So when we're rolling over it. So when I roll over the logo, I want you to implement these transformations. So let's see how that works. I'm going to save this, and we're going to go back to Safari. We'll preview this now, and there you go. Now, half a second, you might find it's a little fast. So if that's the case, I'm going to actually go back, and we can change this to 1. Nice and easy. Whoops. Just come in here and do that. And when I save this, we come back here, you'll see now, think I must have made a change that didn't really work. So I'll go back and fix that. Well, if I save this, this is what we had before. Ah, yes. The only other thing is that I just put in the word 1, or the number 1 rather, instead of 1s, and you got to tell it's 1 second. So that's what I had forgotten to do, which I'll just do right now. Save that, come in here, and I think that's a little bit more subtle. There you go. And remember, we also have this one here, which is changing our element. One last thing I want to say about this, while I did want to show you how to skew any kind of containing box, or in this case, the paragraph itself, I do want you to also recognize that for this particular design, it probably would look better if these were rounded edges, much like the other ones, just to keep it in unison with everything else that's going on here. But nevertheless, it's a good example. It's a good way to show you how that actually works. Now, given that we're looking at all of these transitions, you can probably imagine that any one of these things can be done in a transition fashion. So let's see if we can't take that same transition information that we were working with here and see if we can use it in our H1 that we have in our header. So I'm going to go back. By the way, before I do anything else, I'm going to copy this CSS3 transition information. Let's go all the way up to our header. And remember, we were using some header paragraph information. And what you'll notice here, the paragraph information was fine, but I want to deal with the H1. So let's check this out. I'm going to come in here. We're going to paste this in, and we're dealing with all transitions. Okay, cool. Then what I'm going to do is to copy this information. So the selector that we're using, will have rather a hover state, so it's a pseudo selector. I'm going to close it before I forget to do that. And within here is where we're going to add our text shadow information. So right now the font size is where it is, but I'm going to remove the text shadow information from the H1. In other words, it won't have any text shadow when we start, but when we hover over it, that's when we should see the text shadow. And it won't just be a blink, it's going to be a 1 second transition. So let's save this now. We'll come back here. We should see the text shadow disappear. And when we roll over this, you can see that it's kind of doing what it does, but it's a little sloppy because it's still reading this as text. It'd be much better if that was actually a link. So what should we do in this situation? Well, what I would do instead is to have applied this information to a H1 A tag, and the transition could be in the H1 A tag. And we'll have a hover in there as well. So let me just come in here. Actually, I just want to redo those little elements. So Command Y in this application. So this is what we had initially, but I'm not finding it's really working all that well. So I'm going to come into the header, and this area here I'm going to include an A tag around our link, and if for no other reason, just to make it act like a button and to give it more of the information that I need it to have. So closing A tag. I don't need an ID for it, that's fine. So here where we have our H1, I'm going to make some changes. First of all, I'm going to apply the initial information to the H1A. Remember, now we have an A tag in between our H1. And that's where I want to have this transition information stored. So the H1A has a transition in it, and it's saying transition all of this stuff. That's fine. And then the H1A hover is the one that's going to have the text shadow applied to it. So let's save this, and let's see if that's going to be making any sort of difference to what we want to have. So I'm going to save this, and I will also save the index.html page. So now we can come back here, and you can see it's kind of doing its thing, but I don't really like the fact that, well, number one, we're going to have to define colors for this, and we're also going to have to say no underline. That's fine. There's really nothing wrong with that, but I kind of feel that we should have maybe more of a block level element going on in here. And, you know, I think there's better ways of addressing how this is going to work and what it's going to do for us. But nevertheless, as you can see, any one of these things can be made to work in this fashion for you. So the transitions can work and do all kinds of different things for you as well. So I'm going to go back and remove the A tag for the moment. I don't really feel it looks as good as some of the other effects that I was putting in here. So I'll just take away those. And even if I wanted to, I could still keep the hover for the, you know, H1. That wouldn't have been bad, as we saw. I don't really need the A information anymore, so I would have to take this out of the A and place it inside the H1. And I can remove this as well. So in here, well, first we should save it. Now we will be able to, oh, I'll have to save the index.html page as well. There you go. And now when we roll on this, you'll see that there is, in fact, a transition on it. It's a little sluggish, but we could probably reduce the speed of that transition if we wanted to, or increase it if that suited us better, right? Remember, I could also have said 0.1 second or something along like that, or 0.5. So, nevertheless, that's a little bit more about transitions and how you can apply them to many different things, especially transforms.